Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to read this wonderful book called The Kindness Seed by Linda Appleby and illustrations by Zoe Saunders. Penelope Green was wide awake in bed. She kept thinking about her day. It hadn't gone so well. She had been playing on a swing at the park when a boy came along and demanded she to get off the swing. Penelope was annoyed and said unkindly, "No, I will not get off the swing. You didn't even ask nicely, meanie head." The boy stomped off, shouting, "You're stupid! I hope you fall off the swing." Remembering the hurtful words made Penelope feel sad. She pulled a blanket over her head as big tears spilled from her eyes. She heard a noise peeking from under her blanket. She watched as her room lit up with a bright flash of lights. With bright eyes, she stared with amazement as mean, cruel words floated around the room and then, poof, disappeared. Penelope was no longer in her bedroom. Around her was a delightful woodland with colourful trees and strange-looking animals. The tree smiled and said, "Hello, Penelope." The biggest trees spoke to her in windy whispers about the fairies and the kindness seed. Penelope was excited to hear about fairies and didn't know anything about a kindness seed. She asked the trees to tell her more. Sitting cross-legged upon a rainbow, she listened as the trees told their story. Once upon a time, fairies ruled one tiny kingdom called Leaftopia, a magical woodland that was home to many different creatures. The light and darkness of the woodland came from the old grandmother and grandfather's trees. These rainbow trees glowed, and their branches opened to awaken the kingdom each morning. At the end of each day, the old trees darkened and the rainbow faded as the branches bent together to create a warm and cozy canopy for sleep. Many creatures lived happily in this wondrous place, in the nooks and crannies of the tree roots and the gnarled hollows in between the branches. The woodland creatures did not know fairies watched over them. The queen of the fairies was the most beautiful and sparkliest of them all. While watching over her kingdom, the queen was shocked to hear the Notalots calling the Wobblers mean names. This was not the first time the Notalots had been unkind. The queen knew the Notalots had lost their kindness. They had a big lesson to learn. Not to harm others with mean words. The Notalots needed to get their kindness back. The queen sent for her cleverest fairy, Mrs. Plum to help stop this hurtful behaviour and find their kindness again. Sitting on her favourite leaf was Mrs. Plum. Her faded purple, slightly chubby belly protruded, and her frayed wings sat limply still. As Mrs. Plum watched the Notlots, she thought about how to teach the naughty creatures to be kind again. Sitting beside Mrs. Plum was Miss Indigo, a young fairy with sparkly blue wings and a bright smile. Eager to learn, she asked Mrs. Plum, "Why do we look different from each other?" Mrs. Plum smiled at Miss Indigo's curiosity. "We are part of the earthly rainbow, just like all other creatures," Mrs. Plum said. "Like all fairies, you began as a seed. Wherever your seed first sprouted in the rainbow is where you were born. And so your colour was chosen." Listening to the story, Miss Indigo's wings fluttered with delight. Without a goodbye or thank you, she flew off hastily to share her new-found knowledge. Mrs. Plum sat alone, quietly chuckling at the young fairy's eagerness. Miss Indigo's question had been thoughtful, and an idea sprouted in her wise purple head. Should the young fairies teach the Notlots kindness? Each had lessons to learn. "Yes, that's it!" Mrs. Plum said, to no one in particular. She wackedly swooped off her leaf, the echo of her laughter tickling all the creatures. Mrs. Plum summoned the young fairies with a melodic whistle. Fluttering noisily, row upon row of colourful young fairies arrived. "Hello, and welcome to this very important meeting." The old fairy beamed. Standing in front of her was a hushed crowd of staring, wide-eyed young fairies. Mrs. Plum announced, "Your job is to plant the kindness seed back into the Notlots." The audience of young fairies stirred and whispered to each other. "Now, for the rules. You may not be seen or heard, and you may not use magic fairy wands." Mrs. Plum spoke with delight in her voice. Fairy wings fluttered quickly with excitement. The air around sounded like a busy beehive as they flew away. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Mrs. Plum waited patiently for the young fairies to return. In her hands, she held a teacup filled to the brim with fragrant hibiscus tea. Its hot steam danced in the air as it cooled. In the distance, beyond the wintry vines, she heard the humming of fairy wings. "The young ones are coming back," the old fairy whispered to herself. One by one, the fairies returned and reported how they had each changed a young Notlot into a kind creature. As each fairy completed their work, Mrs. Plum checked it off in her golden book. And that's my favourite colour. She was about to place the final check of completion When she noticed a blank space on the last page, looking more closely, she saw Miss Indigo had not yet reported in. Miss Indigo was still happily flying inside the dreaming mind of a Notlot. She smiled as imaginary planets danced around her head and then turned into bubbles and popped. With each pop she giggled as oodles of rainbow feathers flitted over her. Suddenly she remembered she had an important job to do. Taking a kindness seed out of her pocket and placed it in her hand, she blew her fairy magic into it. The seed began to glow and then burst into a million powerful kindness seeds. The scattered seeds covering the Notlot and the dreaming world, spreading all across the magical kingdom until kindness was dripping everywhere like it was a golden honey. Drizzled with kindness, the young Notlot stopped playing and said, "I am very sorry for hurting the wobblers with my mean words." She skipped off happily, knowing she would never use unkind words again. Miss Indigo smiled proudly and then flew off to give Mrs. Plum her report. The trees finished telling their story to Penelope. She stretched as the magical trees darkened and the branches leaned forwards to make her warm, cozy bed. She closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Penelope awoke in her familiar bedroom. She smiled as she thought about the story told by the trees. Then she remembered the rude boy at the park and her unkindness to him. She was sorry for being mean. She believed in the fairies and the sweet seed of kindness. Now she understood for every kind word. The seed grows and grows as it spreads to others. Suddenly she felt the warm glow of a kindness seed inside her and knew she would never be unkind again. The end. If you like to get this book for yourself, you can find it here. Lots of love. Enjoy reading with me.